Good morning. It's good to be with you this morning. There we go. I'm the student and discipleship pastor here. My name is Lex. And if this is your first time here, we would love it if you would do us a quick favor. So you can find a connection card in the seat back in front of you if you're here in person. If you're online, you can find that popping up in the chat. But what this does, it allows you to tell us a little bit about yourself. Maybe tell us why you're here, if there's a particular reason, or if you have any questions for us. This allows you to write those on there and ask. But it'd be great to connect with you, and this is a really easy way for us to do that. But when you've done that, you can put that in the box by the double doors on the way out, or if you're online, you just simply click Submit. But like I mentioned last week, we have a lot of opportunities to get connected and to get involved over the next couple of weeks because school is starting back. I believe it starts back a week from tomorrow, if I'm remembering correctly. And so with that means there is a lot going on, a lot of ways that you can help out in the community and get connected within our church. And so not relating to school, but kind of relating to school. So the first thing is we have Grief Share that's starting back. If you've been a part of this small group before, it's starting back in 2 weeks on August 27th. It's going to be meeting on 6:30 to 8 p.m. on Sundays. That's all I'm going to mention this morning. I just want to get the date out in front of you. But next week, Ellie Bechtel, who leads up this incredible ministry, she's going to be here to talk a little bit more in depth about that. Other thing this morning I want to mention to you is about Chalk It Up. So that is happening today. That is right after church. There is no artistic ability required. All you have to do is be willing to draw chalk on a sidewalk. And so we're going over to Fairhill Elementary, who we partner with. We're going to be drawing cool designs or the coolest you can come up with on the sidewalks there, and that encourages the teachers, and that encourages the students as they are heading back into a new school year. It costs you nothing, and it happens really quick, and so if you want to be a part of that, you just meet out in the lobby right after church with Pastor Elise, our children's pastor, and she'll be happy to kind of lead the charge as we head over and do that. It'll take no time at all. Next week is Water Wars. Water Wars is something we've been doing for years, and it's a way that we encourage our teens and our children as they're heading back into a new school year to kind of kick things off with a lot of fun the day right before they start school. And so we have a huge water slide, we have a water gun fight, and we have pizza. The water gun fight is where you come in, even if you're adults, because everyone is invited. We have a water gun fight between the adults and the teens and the children. And so it's a lot of fun. It's a great way for you to be able to spray teenagers in the face. And so I would encourage you to get excited about that, get excited about the pizza. But please, please, please sign up. You can find the Sign Up Genius in our weekly newsletter. You can also find it on our website. If you sign up, that tells us how much pizza we need to order. And it also tells us how many volunteers we have to help us to set up. So if you can help set up, make sure you note that on the Sign Up Genius. It would be really helpful. And then last thing I want to mention is our student ministry is starting back up to their regular schedule, but there are some slight tweaks in what we've done in the past. So in the past, we've met on Sunday nights. Now we're going to be meeting on Sunday mornings, and that's to hopefully make things more accessible to everyone, make things more accessible to our parents and our students, and also our student ministry volunteers and leaders. So there will be some slight changes, such as we're going to be meeting from 10:15 to 12:15, which is 30 minutes before worship starts and 30 minutes after, but they're getting everything they had before. The 2-hour times we're together, which includes a message, includes small groups, includes snack, includes games. It's going to be great, and we've rebranded it. It's now being called Sunrise, except with an O, because I like things to be a little bit cheesy. So Sunrise is going to be on Sunday mornings, and we're starting back to that schedule in 2 weeks on August 27th. So talk to your students about it. If you are a student, get excited about it. It's going to be great. Oh, and we'll be taking off every first Sunday of the month because we still want you to be able to be involved in worship team or tech booth or serving in children's ministry, whatever that is. That's a core part of who we are as a church. So there are a lot of things there. But if you have any questions, feel free to talk to me. There's a lot of information on our website and our newsletters, so check that out. Okay. There's even more that I could talk about, but that's way too much already, so we're going to stop there. Just go read your newsletter with everything we have, but get excited about ways that you can get connected. This morning, I want to jump back into our series that we picked up on last week, and we're going to be finishing up this morning. So our series, Pursuing Wisdom. And we talked about this series it's all about the wisdom literature in our Bible. And there are a handful of books within our Bible that could be argued whether or not they are wisdom literature, and many of them are, but there are 3 big ones that aren't argued as much. And so we've talked about Proverbs. Last week we talked about Ecclesiastes, and this week we're talking about the last one, which is the book of Job. If you weren't able to listen to the message last week, you can go on our website and you can listen to it there. We talked about Ecclesiastes quite a bit. But what we said was Ecclesiastes is essentially a commentary on the book of Proverbs. And so where Proverbs says that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, Ecclesiastes responded back and said that's not always the case. That there are times that life is kind of chaotic. There are times that life is random. And Ecclesiastes, it acknowledged that time and death, they kind of have this chokehold on reality. And so Ecclesiastes, it offered us a different kind of wisdom than we're used to, a wisdom that was kind of disgruntled at how God lets life play out sometimes. And this was incredibly relatable to those of us who have experienced how harsh and how unfair life can be. And so this week, we're going to kind of continue in that tone that Ecclesiastes set for us last week with this last wisdom book we're going to be talking about with the book of Job. And so the book of Job, it doesn't offer us a much more positive outlook than Ecclesiastes, but it doesn't talk about every other verse how meaningless life is. So it does have that going for it. But the story of Job is, quite honestly, it is horrific. The story of Job is, it's puzzling, both for Job and for the reader. It's an incredibly unique book. And the reason that so many people find this book fascinating is because something truly terrible happens to a good and moral person, and God just watches it happen. A lot of people feel like that's what happens today too, right? I mean, it feels like God is just kind of staring down on us from heaven and just watching bad things happen to good people. Good people are taken advantage of. Good people are hurt. We've witnessed good people have their homes burned down, good people getting cancer. And since God is loving and God is just, people would assume that God would just put an end to all of the evil in the world. And so clearly the writer of Job had the same question that many of us ponder today, which is, why do bad things happen to good people? Or maybe more specifically, why does God let bad things happen to good people if he's such a good and just God? And so if that's of interest to you this morning, if these are questions that you have ever pondered, then I think the book of Job has some wisdom that it can impart on our lives this morning. So let's see what the book of Job has to say about this question. Now let's walk through the story of Job together this morning. So the book opens by making it clear that Job is a good guy, right? My Bible describes Job as being blameless. He is filled with integrity. And so as readers of this book, we know immediately that we are meant to like Job. We are meant to root for Job. We want this guy we want to see good things happen to Job. But then we're taken to God's heavenly courtroom. And if you're wondering, what is God's heavenly courtroom? You are not alone in that question. This is an ancient understanding of how the universe is ordered and how God functions. And so for us, like when we think about God, we have our own modern, depictions of how we think about God, interacting, being positioned within the universe. And so, you might think of God as being this old guy with a long beard that sits on a throne up in heaven and he's watching down on us. Or you might think of God as like this omnious spiritual being that's off in another dimension and he's kind of there, but he's kind of here. Or maybe you're thinking of God somewhere in between. But we all kind of have our own ways of viewing God. And over time, that changes. And so during this time of ancient Judaism, when they were thinking about God, they thought of God as sitting in a courtroom in the sky with a handful of other divine beings. And so I'm not going to dive into the whole divine being part of this. It's fascinating. I will point you to a resource if you want to learn more about it, and that's the Bible Project. If you've never checked out the Bible Project, they are awesome. They have a great website, BibleProject.com. They have a great podcast, and they talk about spiritual beings and all kinds of other stuff in very relatable ways. And so I would encourage you to go check out that, but I'm not going to nerd out on that this morning, as tempted as I am to do. But anyway, so we go back to God, and God is in this heavenly courtroom with all these divine beings. And God presents Job to be innocent, right? Classic courtroom vernacular. And so Job he's righteous. Job is blameless, and he honors God. But one of the other characters in the story, the Satan, which the Satan, this is more of a role than it is a name, right? I think once we get to the New Testament, we have Satan, right? It becomes more of a name. This is a specific being that we're referring to. But here, the Satan, you can find this term in other parts of our Bible, specifically the Old Testament. This is a role. And what the Satan is he is kind of an accusing attorney. That's the way he functions. And so the Satan, he comes to God, and he's like, look, you say that Job is blameless. You say that Job, he's this amazing person, but look at everything that you have done for Job. And so the Satan is basically saying Job is not as great as you say he is because you've just given him all this great stuff. That's why he's such a good guy. It's easy to be a good person when everything is going right for your life. And so he argues that Job is just good because he's blessed. He's just good out of his own selfish motives. And so apparently that is sinful, and that's not good, is what he's arguing. And so the Hebrew Bible scholar John Walton puts it this way. I don't think I can say it better than he can, so I'm just going to quote his words. He says that the Satan challenges God's policy of rewarding the righteous by suggesting that it corrupts their motives and proves them to be less righteous. And so this accusation, it gives the book an interesting twist. And so for a while, we might be inclined, along with Job and his friends, who we'll get to in a second, to spend time asking why do the righteous people suffer? Instead, the Satan, he flips the question upside down and he asks, why should they prosper? And so as the story goes, God agrees to have Job tested. And so I want you to think of this as God submitting his evidence before the court. And so as a result of this judicial test that Job knows nothing about, by the way, right? As readers, we're privy to what's been happening in this divine courtroom. Job knows nothing about it. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, out of the blue, Job experiences extreme tragedy and trauma. In a matter of minutes, Job loses all of his wealth, and he loses all of his children. And somehow through all of this, Job, he never blames God, not once, but he does grieve, right, naturally. But the Satan, he sees this, he goes back to God, and he says to God, look, Job, he doesn't care as much about that stuff. Job only cares about himself. That's kind of been my whole point here all along, God. Job is selfish. And so, if Job personally suffers, then you're going to see that Job isn't as blameless as you think he is. We need real evidence here to present, okay, in order for me to really make my point. And so God agrees. And the Satan, he makes Job incredibly sick by placing boils just all over Job's body. And so Job, at this point, he doesn't feel good. He doesn't look good. He's lost his health. He's lost his looks. And then on top of that, he's lost his wealth and he's lost his children. And somehow still, through all of this, Job still continues to trust God. And so at this point in the story, it probably feels like, Job has lost everything. There's nothing left for Job. But what we realize is Job is not the only human character within this story, because we still have Job's wife and we have Job's friends. And so for 25 chapters, Job's friends, they put their heads together and they try to figure out why in the world is Job experiencing so much chaos and loss in his life. And their discussion, it boils down to three questions, basically, in these 25 chapters. They're discussing, is God's character truly just? Does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And how is Job's suffering to be explained? But Job's three friends, they're working from a huge assumption of what they believe God's justice should look like in the universe. And if you remember our lesson on Proverbs, their view on the universe is very, very similar to Proverbs. And I like to refer to this as God karma. And so it's this idea that if you do good, if you're putting good out into the universe, then God's going to cause good things to happen in your life. And if you're putting bad out into the universe, you're doing bad things, then you're going to see bad things that are going to start happening in your life. And so they're operating off of this viewpoint. And so knowing that, it certainly makes sense how they approach Job, right? It makes sense why they're grilling Job after all these things that have happened to them. Because if that's how the world works, then Job must have done something wrong, right? I mean, what else, why else would all of this bad stuff be happening to Job? But nonetheless, Job, he insists that he is innocent. He knows that he didn't do anything to deserve the chaos and the loss that has happened within his life. But by Job's standards, or by Job's friend's standards, if Job is innocent, then that means one of two things. That means either God is unjust or Job is a liar. And so being the good, studious followers of God that Job's friends are, they would rather consider that their friend Job is lying, or perhaps he just doesn't remember that he's guilty, rather than assume that God is unjust or that they happen to be wrong. And so they start trying to brainstorm some of the sins that maybe Job might have committed that warrant such a punishment from God. And so they put their heads together and they're like, okay, Job, what could you have done? What could you have done, Job? You're clearly forgetting. Like, Job, maybe you neglected to feed the hungry within your community. Or Job, maybe you neglected to be more charitable with the vulnerable in your community. Or Job, you're rich. Have you been mooching off of your family, right? Are you just taking advantage of other people? Or Job, maybe Job's holier than thou, right? We keep hearing about how amazing this Job character is. Maybe he's just a show-off, right? Maybe he's just really pious and just really showing off how great he is. And so they suggest that there has to be something, right? There has to be something. He must be forgetting because God wouldn't let such terrible things happen to an innocent man. And so after all this, Job is just at the end of his rope, right? He feels like not only are his friends against him, he's starting to feel like God is against him at this point too, because he's realizing, I've done nothing wrong. And so Job, he gets bold. I mean, why not, right? He's at rock bottom at this point. Why not get bold? And so Job, he starts getting bold and he starts accusing God of being a bully. He starts accusing God of essentially orchestrating all of the evil that happens within our world. He basically accuses God of being bad at his job. But nonetheless, he still clings to the hope that God is truly just. And so he demands an explanation from God. He calls out God. And God answers. And so God responds to Job's suggestion that he isn't fit to run the universe by taking Job on this cosmic tour. And so he takes Job and he's taking him around the universe and around the world, and he's showing Job the complexity of creation. He's going around, he's showing Job, he's like, Job, are you seeing this? You've got to see the grand scheme of it all. Can you see creation? Can you see how complex it is? Can you see how I've put everything in motion and made everything tick and made everything work? Like there is so much to see here. There's a larger view that you don't have, Job, that I do have, as I am God and I've created all of this. And he asked Job, he's like, where were you when I created the universe? The universe is so large, the universe is so diverse. And so God's point is that Job is not in a position to accuse God. And so essentially God is attempting to help Job see that he is like a child and God is like a parent. And so sometimes what parents do in their maturity, it seems cruel to the child, right? Like if my daughter, if she has a choking hazard or she has sharp scissors, I'm going to run over and I'm going to take those things away from her for her protection, right? I don't want her to hurt herself. But from her perspective, what I've done is I've gone over to take something that was rightfully hers, to take something that in her eyes was perfectly good, and I've snatched it away from her. And so from her viewpoint, it's incredibly harsh. It's not fair what's happened. And so likewise, Job is meant to understand that he is limited in his perspective. From his perspective, it seems cruel and unfair like it would a child. In Job, he doesn't have the perspective to understand God's affairs. And so God explains to Job that giving a black and white judgment, all of the evil and all the injustice that happens in the world, it's difficult to do that because the world is so complex. And even Job can see that, is what God suggests. Okay, and then God gets to this point that I specifically enjoy because I'm kind of nerdy, and that's the two amazingly fierce beasts, the behemoth and the Leviathan. Okay, the behemoth and the Leviathan. Now, these are two Near Eastern mythological beasts that symbolize disorder and chaos within the universe. And so God, he points out these incredibly dangerous creatures. And he talks about how, these creatures, they're incredible. They have this ability. They're so powerful that with little effort, they could just destroy anything within their path. And so God, he's proud of these animals. I mean, they clearly belong in God's good world. But God is saying you don't just run up to the behemoth and the Leviathan and just start running all over them and touching them and getting in their way, right? You wouldn't do that because you understand that if you did that, they would annihilate you. In God's good world, it's ordered enough for God's people to survive in, but chaos has not been eradicated from God's good world. And just because these creatures are powerful, that doesn't automatically mean that they are evil. The behemoth and the Leviathan, they're out there, they're raw, they're dangerous, and so you might encounter them. They have this power to wreak havoc on anyone, any person or anything's life that they may choose. But what you can't conclude from having a run-in with the behemoth and the Leviathan is that these creatures are evil. And so the point is that God's world, it is amazing. You can't look at these creatures and think that they're not amazing. It's good, but it's not perfect. It's ordered, but it's wild. It's beautiful, but it's dangerous. And so God's answer to why is there suffering in the world? God is saying it's because we live in a world that's not designed to prevent suffering. God says it's because we live in a world that's designed for us to trust God. We live in a world that invites us in to trust in our wisdom that we gather from this book. And so God invites Job to trust in his wisdom, though he cannot understand it. And so after all this, after this amazing tour that God takes Job on of the universe, and he takes him all over, he shows the behemoth and Leviathan and all this stuff, Job finally is like, I get it. I repent. So he takes back all of his accusations that God's a bully, that God's unfit to run the universe. And likewise, God forgives Job. And then what we find is God then turns on Job's friends, which you're kind of excited about after the 25 chapters of them just berating Job, essentially. And God turns on Job's friends and he says, you were wrong for how you treated Job, and Job was right. And so what we know is God didn't necessarily approve of everything that Job said, right? We know that. God proved that through the divine tour he took Job on. But God approves of Job's honesty and his vulnerability with God. And so God appreciates Job's wrestling with God and talking through things with God, because that's the right way to process through such suffering. Job demonstrates for us a legitimate and healthy way to grieve, which is with raw emotion, right? It's certainly on the table. And so after all this, the book, it finally comes to a close, and God ends by blessing Job with more children, and he blesses him with fortune all over again. So that's it. That's the book of Job. We kind of get this happy ending at the end of this story, to this existential story that's presented to us, but we're left with a lot to think about. I mean, we are left with a lot to chew on, because that's what good wisdom literature does. It leaves you with a lot to chew on. And so most people, they walk away from this story wondering why God allowed Job to undergo such horrific suffering. But what I'm suggesting to you is that completely misses the point of this story. It's important to realize that the Satan is not an evil villain that's just bent on hurting Job, and God is not a cruel gambler giving in to the Satan's evil desires. That is the wrong story. But that's the one that is commonly assumed of this book. So I want to go back to the original existential question that I feel like we bring to this story, and that is, what does this book say is the reason that bad things happen to good people? But the thing is, it's a trick question. God never tells Job why he suffered. I don't know if you noticed that or not. God has this grand tour, this grand conversation with Job, and not once does he sit down and tell Job and explain to Job why he has suffered. He does not tell him why bad things happen to good people, and so we don't get to find that out either. Rather, the book of Job, it invites us to trust God's wisdom when we encounter suffering rather than try to figure out the reasons why, because that is suggested to be beyond our comprehension. And so when we search for reasons, we tend to either simplify God, which is what Job's friends did, or we tend to accuse God on limited evidence, which is what Job did. And so this book is inviting us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God and trust that God actually cares and knows what he is doing. That is what the book of Job is all about. And so in many ways, the book of Job, it brings us back to the wisdom that Ecclesiastes presented to us last week, and that is to accept that life is outside of your control. As much as you want to, you can't control or even comprehend the world around you or the God who created it. And so I know it's really easy for me to say that, but I don't say that lightly. Much like this story, life, I know, can be horrific. Right? Life can be traumatic. It can be brutal. It can be harsh. And so the moral of this book is not just get over it. Please, 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 please don't walk away thinking that the moral of the story of this book is to just get over it. In fact, what I want to encourage you this morning is to not just get over it. I want you to wrestle with it, experience. I want you to grieve and to feel and to be authentic. That is what Job demonstrated for us within this story, and then God commended him for it. But the tough wisdom that we receive from Job is that life is outside of our control. We're given a dose of reality that many of us try to reject. I mean, is there any other control freaks, right, in the audience? That's who I am, right? For the last 30 years of my life, I've been doing everything that I possibly can to try to plan and make life go exactly how I want it to. And you know what I've learned? It rarely goes exactly how I want it to. Life is outside of my control. Life is outside of your control, and that's okay, because that's not the role that I was given in this life as a follower of God. I wasn't called to a life of control, nor was I called to a life of comprehension. I was called to a life of faith. And being called to a life of faith is about trust. And I think for so many Christians, they use the term faith to describe their beliefs about God. But that completely misses the point. Faith is not about doctrine. Faith is not about theology. Faith is about trust. Faith is about who you have your faith in, who you believe in. And as followers of Jesus, we put our faith in Jesus. And that faith does not require control. In fact, that faith requires you to reject control. And so if you're someone who you decide to be a follower of Jesus because you thought that would give you a more firm footing in life, you kind of miss the whole point of it all. Jesus talks a whole lot about suffering. Jesus is often trying to shake you off of your footing so you're required to use that faith that you claim that you have. And that is an emotional process. It is not an easy process. It's not easy when life doesn't go our way and when we realize that we don't have control of the world around us. However, we do have control of what we're putting out in the world. Right? We do have control of how we represent God out into the world. And so Carlos Rodriguez, he said this. He said, "It's good to ask, why does God allow so much injustice in the world? It's even better to ask, it's more transformative to ask, why do I?" And so we may not be able to control the world around us, but we can control what we are putting back out into the world around us. We can process our own circumstances, we can process our own emotions, and we can consider whether we can or we should prevent someone else from experiencing the same. We can see the chaos in the world, and we can consider how we can bring more order to it. And as Christians, we are invited to be more than spectators. We were invited to act. We're invited to be agents of change. And so while you may not have all the answers, you do have a direction. Right? You do have a role model. Jesus gave us a great example of what it looks like to live a life like this. And so you have a general idea of which way to prayerfully go. And so that's the powerful thing about emotions. Emotions, they motivate us to react. Your emotions, they're not deceiving you. They are a good thing. I think you should listen to those. And I think that's a large part of what Job teaches us. But let me wrap up this morning before I start repeating myself and causing more suffering in the chaotic world around us. So this morning, I would love for you to walk away with all the answers. I think that you'll be wiser walking away with questions. I genuinely hope that you walk away this morning with a feeling of perplexity at what the book of Job has presented to us. I hope that the book of Job, I hope that it runs through your mind as you're driving home, as you're showering, as you're sitting on the toilet, and as you're laying in bed at night trying to fall asleep. I hope the story of Job continues to run throughout your mind. I hope the wisdom of Job and all the other wisdom books, I hope that they have drawn you in and they are forcing you to ponder the complexity of our lives and of our God. Because I believe that it's in our pondering, it's in our questioning, it's in our feeling, it's in our praying, and it's in our seeking that we find new angles of God that we never knew existed. And so that is my prayer for you this morning. So let's pray just that together. God, we love you and we thank you so much. God, this life that you've given us, it's a paradox. It is incredibly beautiful. It is also incredibly hard at times. There are parts of life that are really hard for us to process, really hard for us to understand. And when we think about you, who is already incomprehensible, when we think about how you interact in the world and how you interact with our own lives, God, it's personal. It's difficult. It's a lot. And so, God, I pray that you will give us wisdom. I pray that you'll give us the wisdom to chew on and process what you've presented to us within the Bible, within specifically the wisdom books especially. I pray that you will give us the faith to trust you as we chew on these very difficult questions. I hope that you'll give us the courage to be bold and to have emotions and allow us to listen to those emotions and talk to you and process things. God, if we're going through something right now, if we're still processing life right now, I hope that you help us to do that. I hope you help us to grieve and to feel and to find the support that we need to get through that. God, we don't have all the answers. I would dare say we have more questions than answers, but God, I hope that we find you in those questions. And I pray that you will continue to look after us. I pray that you'll continue to lead us, and I pray that you will bless us. God, we love you, and we pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Let me give you one last reminder of everything we talked about at the beginning. We have Chalk It Up today, right after church. Just meet out in the lobby with Pastor Elise. The week after that, we have Water Wars right after church. Make sure you sign up to help or to attend. And then in 2 weeks, we have Grief Share, and we have Sunrise that's starting up for our student ministry. So get excited about that. Find a way to plug in within our church. And with that, I would encourage you to stand as our worship team is going to lead us out.